Thank you, Robert and Eric. That was great.
Thank you.
Kate, are you there to sort of pick up maybe questions?
Yes, I am here, and I do see a couple questions that have come in. One came in while Robert was speaking. I don't know. It says, from Kevin, it says, why or how did the undesirable immigrants of the late 19th and early 20th century, Southern, Eastern Europeans, also Catholics and Jews, become part of what is considered part of the white population today?
That is a terrific and on point question, and it's not an easy one to answer in a brief moment. It happens over many decades. And some people would say that even by the 1970s, it's not entirely complete. But I think the easiest way to describe it is that none of these groups from Europe, however despised Catholics might have been, however despised Jews might have been, there was a kind of foothold in American institutions that was possible for them. And whether those institutions were educational, government, business, there were places that immigrants from these groups were able to secure a kind of foothold. And it's often from that foothold, famously, the Irish were deeply involved in urban politics in a number of cities, and in some places even came to dominate the political machinery of those cities, and urban police departments and those kinds of things. So it's partly through the capacity of immigrant groups to find institutions where they can gain a foothold, and through those institutions then leverage greater and greater belonging. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is the decline. It's a kind of more of an ideological shift, which is the decline of a certain kind of racial science over the course of the 20th century that was invested in separating the world into not just racial categories but racial hierarchies. And these came under assault heavily in the middle decades of the 20th century, and by the 1950s and 1960s were, especially in academic circles and increasingly in popular ones, were really discredited. And what that opened up is an interesting paradox, right? On the one hand, so you see it in Johnson's speech in 1965, right? He says the National Origins Act is terrible because it discriminates against all these people, and we know that's bad now. Everyone really is the same and equal, and that's the way things should be. And so that there's an interesting paradox, though, that you introduce a kind of new liberal age in which understandings of racial difference are not intrinsically linked to hierarchies of people. And yet the world is divided into industrialized, developed countries and underdeveloped former colonial places. And that division, which we know was in part based on race, then becomes the reality into which this new liberal age takes place. So to put a fine point out, then I'll stop. So when the contemporary president can say, right, why do people come from these blank hole countries, and he doesn't actually ever say anything about race. But what he's referencing is that these are places that are poor because they're former colonial possessions of the European empires, and they were underdeveloped across the whole of the 19th and 20th century. So on the one hand, you can say, well, he's not saying anything about race. He's not saying that they're racially inferior. He's just saying the countries are badly run and are poor. But that itself is a kind of function of this earlier period. So that's not a great answer to that question, but it starts down that road. It's a complicated question to answer, but I think it is absolutely the right question to ask.
This is Rebecca, and just in like 30 seconds I'd add that this is kind of a lively historiographical topic. There are some historians who focus on people coming and being racial others and then over time becoming white, how the Irish became white. And there are others who have pointed out, as Robert suggested, that, there are certain advantages, residential, educational, economic, in the jobs, in the job sphere that are open to certain newcomers more than others from a very early date. And so I think that it's as historians have moved to study whiteness as part of studying race and to recognize that the idea of whiteness itself has a history and has changed over time. This is something that has been at the forefront of that discussion, and it's actually undergoing lively debate now.
Thank you. We do have another question that's come in, and this question asks, do you believe there is a difference between legal and illegal immigration?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, there are two ways to answer it, right? One would be to say that there are a set of laws in place that define whether someone is documented or undocumented when they're in the United States. The other would be, as a historian, would be to situate the laws themselves in a political and social and historical context, as we've tried to do today, and say, look, the people who were illegal in the 1890s were Chinese, and so they were going to Mexico and trying to walk across the border and pose as Mexicans. So the ways in which those laws have unfolded, I mean, those laws are historically constructed and have changed over time. And then beyond that, that's really a 20th century question in a lot of ways for Robert, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think you've provided the essential methodology, Rebecca, to think through that. As I said at the beginning of my short presentation, the state becomes a more and more central player in these debates across the 20th century, and laws about who is documented and who is not, and who is therefore in the country legally and who is not, become really central to the immigration debate in the 20th century. So yes, it's an objective fact of the law that there are people who have legal status because of the nature of the law, and there are people who do not have legal status. So that's an inescapable fact. But I think in a history class, the question to ask is, where do those laws come from? What are the bases on which they're creating these categories? What kinds of ideas and what interests feed the construction of those laws, and so on. So I would, as Rebecca suggests, I would historicize that.
All right. Do we have any additional questions? If you have an additional question, please feel free to type it into chat now. We'll give you a minute or so here to see if we have any additional questions. Any additional thoughts by our panel? We did have an earlier person ask about the Klan photo, if that was a photo of a Klan wedding.
Yes, and I posted an answer. Hopefully everybody can see that. Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that's really important in helping students understand racism and nativism is to understand how normalized they have been in various periods. And the 1920s is a really good example, and I think the Klan is a really good example, because when people think about the Klan, they think about people hiding in the middle of the night, night riders, people with hoods on, people whose identities are hidden, and it has to be sort of secret. But in fact, the Klan was a mainstream institution in the 1920s. You know, there were thousands of Klan leaders who marched down the streets in parades. Klan membership was an open, celebrated thing. And as I suggested with the link that I sent to the site from the Pacific Northwest and state of Washington, that that it was quite integrated in social life, Klan picnics and so forth. And if you read newspapers, Klan newspapers from the 1920s, what's really striking is how normal they are in a lot of ways, and they're reporting on, at the same time they're virulently racist, they're also reporting on the kind of social life of Klan members in a very ordinary newspaper kind of way. So I think that helps students grapple with racism not as something that you would say, well, there's this little group of people over there who are racist, but as to think of it as something as part of the sort of texture and fabric of American life through all of American history, and therefore to reckon with it in a little bit of a different way today.
Thank you. I believe that is it for our questions. I would like to thank everyone for attending tonight and thank our panelists for an excellent presentation. If you would like a PDF of the PowerPoint or the document, you can contact hsmarketing@bfwpub.com. And if you would like a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, you can contact me at kkingsbury@bfwpub.com. This textbook will be out and will be actually shipping from our warehouse on February 2nd. We're very excited, and we're very excited to get a copy out to each of the attendees. I'd like to thank you all.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks to all of you, and thanks, Kate, for moderating.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.